Greetings, friends. Juan Ingriski here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukraine war update for the week of October 27th through November 2nd. No, did I say 27th or 22nd? I missed October 27th through November 2nd of 2025. There we go. This past week, basically. And this week, we have a lot of updates. So if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukraine war updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, comment your thoughts, share this video around. Keep being amazing. And what is amazing is how the Ukrainians have not left this Pokrovsk pocket, because this is the biggest news. We're in the Pokrovsk direction, and basically the big news is that Pokrovsk is basically completely encircled. Before we could have said, when now technically it's not a full encirclement, but like, look at this map, look at this here. There is almost, you could just imagine that this small 2-kilometer corridor is just swarming, just constantly with drones, and then you have to just walk through, walk through all these, through these fields to get to Grishny, just to try to escape, but while you're doing that, you're like out in the middle of everything. So just, there's all the Ukrainian sources are now, if you're not Zelensky, if you're an actual Ukrainian source on the ground, are talking about how horrible the situation is. But if you're talking to Zelensky, basically Pokrovsk and Milgorod, completely good, nothing's bad happening in Pokrovsk. But actually it is very bad, because the Russians are about to completely capture Pokrovsk. This was a very big. I thought the Ukrainians would mount some sort of last-ditch defense along the rail line. That before, last week we talked about the Russians were clearing the southern part of Pokrovsk. I'm like, wow, that's gonna, maybe that might take a little bit, and the Ukrainians could consolidate in the north. It seemed like there was just the Russians just bled through, and it seems like this entire northern part is about to be taken. And I wouldn't be surprised if by next week that Pokrovsk has fallen. And once Pokrovsk falls, I have no doubt that Minograd's probably going to fall as well. I think the biggest problem is that it's so hard to leave that, and that the Ukrainians are still like doing counterattacks, which we'll talk about in a moment here. That, it might take a while for the Russians to even clear up Minograd. So even once Pokrovsk gets taken and closes Minograd, the Ukrainians are just going to be stuck there, and they're just not going to leave, and they'll just have to be completely rooted out, which might take some time. Which maybe that's the thing, is that there'll be the sacrificial lambs while the Ukrainians build up some new defenses near Grishny and Belitsky, around these towns to the south of Dnipropetrovsk. So, and right now they're just trying to, and maybe they're hoping that this giant offensive that they're pushing into Dnipropetrovsk will block it. So there's a lot of moving gears and wheels and shit. So let's talk about what happened. Again, we talked about the Russians have broken through into the northern part of Pokrovsk. We had the Russians in the most northern residential area right here. So this residential area has been taken. I have no doubt that this residential area has also been taken. Now, again, I don't want to repeat myself every week, but again, it's not like for example, in this map, it shows that this area is under Russian control, but this area is under Ukrainian control. That does not mean it's like 100% Ukrainian control or 100% Russian control. Again, it's more fluid. But what this shows is that probably the southern part of Pokrovsk is getting more and more from being maybe 70% under Russian control, and there's like pockets of resistance here, to now, more and more of this area is now completely cleared of Ukrainians, and the Russians are able to start accumulating forces here without having to be worried about much. Now, as we go towards the center and the north, it's more fluid, but it's probably more under Russian control than not. But now the main area that most mappers are saying that are still mostly under Ukrainian control, Pokrovsk, and it's not mostly fluid, is this kind of residential area in the northeastern part of Pokrovsk, kind of like this area right behind this highway here and rail line. Is it a rail line, or is it just a road? Looks like a rail line. Anyway, this area is like the last kind of fortress or kind of stronghold the Ukrainians are trying to hold on to, this northeastern part. And so, this kind of northeastern area is probably where the biggest clash are going on, where the Ukrainians are trying to say, no, we're still holding on to Pokrovsk. Now, this northwestern area, this area with the gas station and this industrial zone, has been complete. We had more and more geolocated confirmation of the Russians being here. In fact, most mappers are starting to now pushing. We have DRGs operating in these dachas to the north of Pokrovsk here as well. Now, one thing that's actually was really crazy is that, let's talk about it now, is that about this giant Black Hawk, Pigger down, Black Hawk down, Pig down helicopter raid from the Special Forces group, and they landed right in this area in the north here, and if you saw the drone footage, they were getting picked off all around this area. So the Ukrainians landed in this area, and accordingly, they were trying to unblock this area. I talked about how taking this industrial zone is very important because this cuts off the main logistics into Pokrovsk. And now, as you can see, there's really, it's pretty much impossible to send any, vehicles into Pokrovsk now. So most people are saying that now it's just by foot. You only can take what you can by foot. And while probably this road is not completely cut off yet, we'll talk about more about the Radinsky area in a moment. It's not like oh look at this. There's one road here. It's not like oh it's a free road because it hasn't been cut in this area just yet. Um, it's very much like a complete cluster. Even like 3 or 4 weeks ago, when Pokrovsk was in a better shape for the Ukrainians, we had there was video showing about a huge amount of like Ukrainian vehicles being destroyed here. Before maybe they were able to. Every vehicle they send, maybe 1 out of 4 was able to arrive, but now it's impossible. So now these fields are only used for walking. So yeah, Pokrovsk is being broken into. We also talked about more and more, probably the southern parts being cleared. And this is big news because now the Russians could accumulate more and more forces. This is the biggest thing about Pokrovsk is that while yes, it was the biggest logistics and center for the western part of Donbass that supplied a lot of the Ukrainian defenses, it's also that the case that the biggest thing about this war is you want to have a huge amount of you want to have areas where you can accumulate forces so that you could then continue doing your village hopping or stronghold hopping, as I've called it, so that you could again take the next biggest stronghold. So taking Pokrovsk now that the southern part of Pokrovsk is mostly cleared of Ukrainian troops, the Russians could accumulate a huge amount of forces here to continue pushing. And we saw that for example, as the Russians continue pushing, we also saw that the Russians have completely captured the villages of Ganivka and Ri. It's kind of funny how these areas are basically just part of Pokrovsk, but for some reason they're administratively separate. I mean, I don't know why that's the case, but, why not? But anyways, these two villages, technically up to this rail line, have been captured by the Russians as well. So, this kind of this area right here was kind of more of because since the Russians entered through this area, this kind of eastern part of Pokrovsk was more, the southeastern part of Pokrovsk was held on for another week or so, more than the other parts of the southern part. So since the Russian axis of attack kind of came through this direction here and entered into this area, which then they broke into this area and then into this area, this was kind of the modus operandi of the Russian attack. And there was also that, because the Russians were starting to get into the backs, it seems like they were also able to enter the citadel somehow, and then this entire citadel collapsed, and then as they continued. I'm making a bunch of lines here, but basically, Ri and Ganivka were kind of the last bastions of Ukrainian resistance in the southern part of Pokrovsk, and they were captured. So now the main area of Ukrainian defense is right here around this area, this kind of intersection of everything. The Ukrainians, as we mentioned with the Black Hawk Down accident, where they're trying to unblock it. Again, they're trying to, they're sending a bunch of. They have their Dobropilia counterattack, which we'll talk about. They try to unblock here, which ended in failure. But as you can see, it seems like they don't have any. They're not going to withdraw, which is kind of stupid at this point. I know, they've held on for so long, but it's like you're going to lose a bunch of men, and the people in Minsk are pretty much doomed. Like maybe they think that they could do a last ditch attack and open up enough to have them leave. Maybe it's like it just depends on their mode. Like if they're attacking so that they could open up the line, maybe push the Russians back. From this area, there's been a lot of counterattacks in Radinsky trying to open up this area. There's been the counterattack here trying to push the Russians from the north. If they could somehow push the Russians back kind of to the rail line and to Radinsky, this could give them enough of a room where, while it's dangerous, they could probably withdraw by foot their forces from Minigrad into Grishny. And if that's their goal, that's I think that's a decent operation. Now, if the goal is that they could somehow retake Pokrovsk, or that they could continue the operation to continue this battle, that's completely retarded. That's very stupid. So it just depends on what the reasoning for the Ukrainian counterattacks are. Is it to actually just give breathing space so the Ukrainians that are trapped in Minigrad could leave? That's probably a good idea. Is it because they actually think they could win the battle for Pokrovsk or keep it going? That's very stupid, and that'd be very retarded. But we shall see how that. But I wouldn't be surprised if this area collapses sometime in November. Maybe by next week. We shall see. Also in Minigrad, the Russians are now bleeding into the town as well. trying to just completely force the Ukrainians out. The battle for the southern part is still ongoing. We had more geolocations of the Russians being in this mine, so it looks like the Russians are probably trying to accumulate in this mine shaft here. Probably trying to, push through. Push through the southern part, and probably the Ukrainians are trying to retreat from here. I have no clue why the Ukrainians are still near Suka Yar and the southern part of Minigrad. Like I would think they would try to like withdraw to this area here just to, like, because if you look up, like, look how, like, yes, the pocket looks really, really horrible. Like, imagine trying to continuously sending troops here. I mean, that's really retarded. It'd be much better if the Ukrainians were somewhere like this. You see, it's still a pocket, but it's a lot, and it's more, like, more stable. But, they're trying to fight for every single piece of land. It's really retarded. But yeah, the Russians are now in the southern part of Minigrad. They're also entering the northern part of Minigrad. We had most mappers are saying the Russians have entered this residential area in the northern part of Minigrad right here, trying to take this area. A lot of sources are saying the Russians are like bleeding from the south here, capturing these kind of warehouses and entering this kind of how do you say it, this district in the northern part of Minigrad right here. Though I think it has a bunch of high-rise buildings, so the Ukrainians could counterattack here and probably try to hold off the Russians from here. But yeah, the Russians are now bleeding into the northern part of Minigrad and just slowly squeezing this pimple. So this pocket will probably close up or be defeated very soon. And yeah, but Pokrovsk will probably fall by the end of next week. And for Minigrad, just depends on how easy it is for the Russians to kick the Ukrainians out of here. Now, if we look at also there's a the main thing about this is that now that the Russians are, they're capturing, fortifying this area as their bastion, and the Ukrainians' bastions in Grishny. So the lines are kind of consolidating. I don't think there's any. The Russians are clearing out any resistance that's here, and the Ukrainians are basically using Grishny as the operational center to launch counterattacks. So if the Russians could hold on to their positions in this kind of industrial zone in the northwest of Pokrovsk, they're able and hold off any counterattacks, they could definitely finish off the Ukrainians in this pocket. Now, in the Dnipropetrovsk area, which is kind of part of the Pokrovsk direction, this is where the Ukrainians are having more success, though, again, I don't actually seen a lot of geolocations of this. We talked about how we had geolocations of Kuchev Yar being taken, right? And this area in around Vilnius. So it's like, okay, I can see and we also had something in Shushki here. So I'm like, okay, the Ukrainians are in these kind of areas. But what a lot of the difference between, at least I haven't seen anything, but the difference between geolocations and maps are a bit far off. Like, for example, in the Pokrovsk area, we have geolocated confirmation of the Russians being up here, here, and so forth, and here. But in the north here, the difference between where the Ukrainians are versus the map is a bit fluid. Now, again, this entire area, I think, is one of the biggest fluid areas ever. I think from Rudinsky up to Kucher Yar, and even in Shakova and such, like, this kind of area is very fluid. Now, again, some more than others. For example, in, like, this kind of area is probably mostly under Russian control, but, Belitsky is under full Ukrainian control. So, and then everything between, I would say this area from Volodymyrivka to Fedorivka is like 100, probably mostly 100% Russian control, and then from like maybe Nova Donbass to Belitsky is 100% Ukrainian control, thereabouts. Now, between this is very fluid. Maybe from this area to Nikolaevka and Zhatashok, I think, my opinion, this is where it's mostly under Russian control. But it's not necessarily 100. The Ukrainians could probably bleed into Zhatashok and Nikolaevka and Novoshakhova, but maybe from Vilna and such, and Kuchev Yar is under mostly Ukrainian control, but the Russians could still enter Kuchev Yar, for example. We just need more geolocation confirmations. Now, one thing we actually do have a bunch of geolocated confirmation is the Ukrainians doing a bunch of counterattacks into Rudinsky. We have geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in Rudinsky, but this week they actually even said they captured Rudinsky. But we actually had geolocated confirmation of the Ukrainians trying to enter Rudinsky, and they actually did. They got attacked, and their vehicles got blew up. But that does not mean they were able to dismount infantry beforehand. So Rudinsky is not as secure as we would think. This entire area in the northern part of Dnipropetrovsk is a lot more fluid. It's not catastrophic, as if you look at Ukrainian maps, you would think that it's 100% under Ukrainian control and they're about to cut off this entire salient. No, it's definitely the Ukrainians they have basically eliminated the salient pretty much. But I think the Russians are still where their northern kind of encirclement of Pokrovsk and Leningrad is still safe. Because they're still able to attack into Shakova, which we don't have any more updates to see how that went. We don't know if they captured, if they got kicked out, but we still need some more clarifications. But it does. But one thing I think is for sure about Dnipropetrovsk is that the Ukrainians are on the counterattack, and this is another place where they're trying to, break. The idea is that they could recapture Radinsky, recapture these villages here, and then kick. If they could kick the Russians back to this area, then suddenly, even if the Russians capture Pokrovsk, for example, then it's no longer much of a threat because then they have ways to start supplying Leningrad. But again, I don't think I think the Ukrainians are cheering too early. They have not kicked the Russians out of Radinsky. Radinsky is under mostly probably Russian control, but again, the Ukrainians are still probably resistance in Radinsky. Same thing in these villages up here in Zaporizhia, Novashakova, Dorbozhinia here, Shakova. So in these fields to the south of Kuchiyar, I think these are still fluid, and it's not 100% under full Ukrainian control. It's very fluid. It's like a mixture of fluids, so it's very much that's the case. So yeah, that's the Pokrovsk direction. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Dnipropetrovsk direction. Technically, maybe the Glyapulya direction or the Pokrovsky direction. It depends on which area. Again, it goes from Ivanovka down to Glyapulya. But this is also an area where the Russians are making a lot of rapid progress. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about kind of this most central part of it in the Dnipropetrovsk direction. One of the biggest news is that the Russians have completely captured the village of Vishana here. This village right here. I might be wondering, why is that so big news? Like, what's so different between that and some other one of these random villages? The thing about Vishana is that if you look down, look how big it is. Now, you might think it's obviously we looked at Pokrovsk, that's obviously huge, but this is in terms of these like open steppe areas in Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk. All these villages are like one-street villages. There's not a lot of buildings, but Vishana, as you can see, has the ability to accumulate a lot of forces for the Russians. So the Russians could accumulate, maybe 100, 200, 300 soldiers in this direction, as opposed to maybe just a couple of squads in these areas. And so it's a lot. This will be a good vantage point for the expanding Russian operational objectives here. So Vishana was completely captured. I thought the Ukrainians would put up a bigger fight for Vishana, but that was not the case. Along with this, the Russians have continuously expanded their presence here. We saw that before. We saw the Russians being in this kind of in Pervilia in the southern part of Kharkov. And this week we had 100% confirmation that the Russians have completely captured this village right here and are expanding their presence beyond, trying to take more of these like tree lines across the Yancha River just to have some buffer space here. Same thing's happening in Zaladada here. We also saw how do you say it? We also saw that and also, one of the biggest news, as well as was the fall of Ashana, is that the Russians are now battling for the village of Dnipropetrovsk here. This is another pretty decent-sized village, but I have pretty good confidence that the Russians will take this village. And the biggest news, if Dnipropetrovsk falls, is that this would cut the Pokrovsky-Glyapolya highway, which is one of the main logistics centers, or like roads for Glyapolya. Now, that being said, that does not mean Glyapolya is completely cut off from logistics. If you kind of look down here, there's a bunch of like these like kind of country roads, kind of between this highway and this highway, that you could bypass, and then they kind of enter through Zaporizhia here and then to Glyapolya. So what the Russians will have to do eventually is do some sort of, I know this is very risky, but do some sort of big direct counterattack, or not counterattack, but offensive, just to break into Zaporizhia and just solidify yourself here. This would actually cut off most logistics to the Ukrainians, because then you could continue pushing southwards, and then from here, as you can see, the Russians are in this area. And the Russians are pushing south from here. Then, as you can see, that actually puts the squeeze on Glyapolya in a very big way. So, but if without the attack from here, the Ukrainians could still be supplied through here. Now, that being said, since it's so close to the front line, the Russians in this direction could just drone any forces here. While as before, the Ukrainians could have sent so many drones down this direction before the Russians could attack them, and then they could have a chance to enter Glyapolya. But with the physical cutting off of the Glyapolya road here, if the Russians take Dnipropetrovsk, it will be the logistics for Glyapolya will be a lot more hindered. But again, it's not been cut just yet. The Russians have just entered Dnipropetrovsk, so we shall see if the Ukrainians can put up a fight for this village. But considering this rapid pace of the offensive here, I don't think it will take that long. I probably expect next week this road will be cut. Also, along with this, the Russians are expanding their offensive northward, just improving their positions here. We had 100% confirmation of the Russians taking the village of Nova Alexandrivka, this village right here, and probably clearing these fields between Nova Alexandrivka and Sivka of Ukrainians. Some pro-Russians are saying it's the village of Guy. This village right here, which is a one-way street village right next to Nova Alexandrivka, has been taken, but we don't have 100% confirmation of that. But I'm pretty certain it's probably being cleared, and they're just making the footage right now. And so, as we can see, we're seeing what the purpose of the Russian offensive operation here is. Is that they're trying to hold some positions on the north of this kind of river that flows like in this direction, and there's this other river, the Vochka River, that goes like this. And so, the Ukrainians have to cross the river to attack the Russians that are advancing here, but the Russians don't want to have this entire space be open to the Ukrainians. They want to have the Ukrainians be pushed up right against the river, and they're blowing up all these bridges in Pokrovsk and Dnipropetrovsk, so that the Ukrainians trying to attack them are very much hindered, and then they could have some small groups in these kind of small villages to the north here that could be spoilers to kind of thwart any sort of Ukrainian counterattack, so that the main Russian offensive in the south is more protected. So this just improves their northern flank a lot. So, also, almost all Ukrainian positions on the eastern side of the Yanshur River has been taken. We had 100% confirmation of the villages of Krasnogorski being taken. We also had 100% confirmation of the village of Privilia being taken. So this kind of area right here was kind of the last stronghold for the Ukrainians. So they kind of retreated on the other side of this river. And now the only place on this kind of Uspenivka defense line, from Vishana to Uspenivka, which is where the main axis of the Russian offensive has been focused on for this for the month of October, and now it's kind of almost ending, is the main kind of prize here, Uspenivka, which is the biggest village in this area. And so the battle for Uspenivka has now officially started. The Russians are battling for this town, and with the Russians being right on the other side of it, approaching it from the north, approaching it from the south, I have no doubt that Uspenivka will probably fall within a week or so. So, this will be and once Uspenivka falls, this will be the new kind of defense line for the Russians, and then they will use kind of this new defense line to then push more further west towards the highway. And then I think the main focus will be on Gallipoli. I think that's where the Russians will focus on, to try to take out Gallipoli. Again, there's another river that kind of flows right behind this highway right here. It goes like this. So I think the Russians will try to reach this river and then just kind of move south along this river, at the same time probably pushing from this area. And as you can see, just continuously pushing the until they start putting the squeeze on Gallipoli. And so that is what I think the Russians will do. The main... I probably will rename this direction the Gallipoli direction, even though this kind of encompasses this Novopolovka area as well. But yeah, kind of the main axis probably is Gallipoli. But right now, the focus is on they have to clear out Uspenivka. But that is actually happening on this kind of more southern part of this Gallipoli area. Is the Russians are making a lot of rapid progress. The mappers are saying, even pro-Ukrainian mappers are saying, that this kind of southern part of Uspenivka has been captured by the Russians, and that only the central and northern part remain under Ukrainian control. And so that's a very big gain. We don't have any GLK confirmation of that, actually, but since even deep states acknowledging that, that means that, Uspenivka is probably in very much deep trouble. Also, according to a lot of even pro-Ukrainian mappers, but not geolocations, is that the Russians are marching to the west of Mlynovka and Poltavka, and actually have captured a bunch of these tree lines that are to the west of Poltavka. So now there's a bunch of trenches that are near Novi and Novo-Uspenivka in this area right here. They kind of form as kind of these trenches because the Ukrainians were expecting a direct Russian counterattack from the south here, which is kind of where this is coming from. But if Uspenivka falls, they could attack it from the east, and this could actually collapse the Ukrainian defenses that are being built around this area, or not built, have been built. And also, the Russians are trying to push towards these kind of set of villages, Vasola, Zelona High, and Vasovka. So I have, this taking these three villages will put the Russians even closer to Gallipoli from this direction. So I have no doubt that the Russians will probably take something like this, and then, push something like this, and just kind of continuously pressing Gallipoli on multiple directions. As you can see, the main goal is to put Gallipoli in a operational encirclement with only one way out. And that will be continuously under drone attack. So it's a very big, how do you say it? Bad news for the Ukrainians in the Gallipoli direction. So, and then a bit more to the north here, In this area, it looks like the Russians are consolidating around Ivanovka, making their bridgehead more stable. But the biggest news, according to this mapper and according to Syriac, some pro-neutral, and even neutral sources and such, is that the battle for Poltavka, Novopolovka has started, and that the Russians are now actually entering the most kind of southern part of Novopolovka. Now, Novopolovka is split in two, but that is where the Ivanovka bridgehead takes place. Is that the Russians will probably try to be, clearing out these tree lines in this direction, so that then they could assault Novopolovka, the northern part of Novopolovka, and then from here the Russians could then also clear out the southern part of Novopolovka. So we don't have any geolocated confirmation of this, but even it's not just like a Russian rumor. It's actually something that neutral and even I think some Ukrainian sources are saying that Novopolovka is being stormed, but we don't know the exact configuration of that yet. So, but that is something to be. We have seen that the Russians have been clearing these fields to the south of Novopolovka. We saw the Russians creating this bridgehead in Ivanovka. So it's very much a that the Russians have put in the necessary pieces to start storming Novopolovka, or at least put DRGs in this area. So we shall see how that develops. But again, taking Novopolovka could be a very big boost for the Russian gains in the Dnipropetrovsk direction. And then in the Zaporizhia direction, just a small change. We don't know exactly what's happening in Kharkov after that attack, so nothing there. But again, in this area, we had geolocated confirmation of the Russians actually being more further north in Primorska, kind of around this kind of closed grocery shop, this kind of grocery store right here. This area right here, we had the Russians clearing the areas here. The Ukrainian sources are saying that they did a counterattack and pushed the Russians out. But my main gut is that kind of this area is now becoming more and more of a gray zone, and that the Ukrainians are probably more up in this kind of more built up area in the north. But if you kind of as they push to the southern part of Primorsk, is more of a gray zone, or even under mostly Russian control. So this probably area is probably more of a gray zone than under Ukrainian control, because we saw the Russians operating in this direction here. But it does show that the Russians have improved their flanking operations in the western part of Steppenhersk. Also, pro-Ukrainian mappers are saying that Steppenhersk has been completely kicked. The Russians that were in the southern part of Steppenhersk have been kicked out. That could be true. But the Russians still have the citadel where they could accumulate forces. So it's very much a this is the citadel for the Russians. This is the citadel for the Ukrainians, and this is where the nexus of the attacks are. So I do think the southern part of Steppenhersk is also a big gray zone. I don't think the Ukrainians are here, but it's also probably hard for the Russians to accumulate try to move from here and try to put up positions here, because this is just two streets, and the Ukrainians could bomb these positions very easily from their more higher positions in the central part of Steppenhersk. So the battle for Steppenhersk is still ongoing, but I don't, it definitely can be. I don't, it definitely could be true that the Russians got kicked out of Steppenhersk, but I do think that the Russians probably could still enter this area, and it's probably more of a gray zone than complete Ukrainian control, as this map says. But yeah, Steppenhersk, at least it's tying out Ukrainian forces in the Zaporizhia direction. Now that we talked about kind of this direction, you might think, oh, we're going to go to, maybe Kostyantynivka. Actually, we're going to go to the Kupyansk and Kharkov directions, because that is actually where a lot of interesting things are happening. And because this is also kind of like the second, besides Pokrovsk, this is where the biggest, sexy, big battles going on in Kupyansk. And basically, this week is that the battle for Kupyansk is in its final stages. It's not as done as Pokrovsk just yet, mostly because Kupyansk is split in half by the Oska River, so there's still another piece of it that the Russians have to take. But that piece is very much screwed, though, even though maybe it's still under mostly Ukrainian control, but not so much anymore this week, as we'll talk about. But anyway, the biggest thing of this news is that basically the entire right bank of Kupyansk, in this, we talked about the Russians were battling for the southern citadel, has been taken, because most mappers are now saying that the Russians have captured the southern part of the southwestern part of Kupyansk, are now breaking through into these fields of the south. And actually, the Russians said they took the village of Sadova. Though, just like Soboblavka and such, like kind of this area right here, I think it's more of a gray zone, and the main goal, according to most Russian sources, are trying to reach the village of Azonovo here, which will cut off the main logistics line to the one, because once Kupyansk falls, it will go to its little cousin Kupyansk-Vesoloya, this kind of city right here, to be the main axis of Ukrainian resistance on the other side of the Oska River. But if they could take Azonovo, that would cut off the main logistics hub that supplies Kupyansk, Vozoloya, and as you can see, I think there's a river here as well, or maybe like a rail line. Is there a river? Yeah, the Senovka River. So if they take Ozavnia and maybe some villages that are to the north of this river, like these villages right here, and then have some take the village of Blagdanovka here and have something like this going on, and if you kind of let me kind of scroll out here so you can see the bigger picture, is that if they take something like this going on and then along the river, as you can see, this continuously puts the squeeze on the Ukraine positions on the other side of the Oskol River and makes it more and more untenable to hold. So as you can see, one of the biggest things about Kupyansk is that not only will Kupyansk fall, which is a pretty big city onto itself, not as big as Pokrovsk actually, but it's still a pretty big city, and it's actually very important because the logistics center of Kupyansk allows them to then start bleeding into the eastern part of Kharkov Oblast. But because once this area falls, then all this entire huge area, this entire Pimple area, this entire area in the north and next to Kupyansk will also fall, and this will be a very bad news for the Ukrainians. And yeah, so the Russians clearing out. Now that being said, I don't put it past that there's probably still resistance areas in Kupyansk, that probably the southern citadel still has some Ukrainians in the basement. It's kind of the same thing as Pokrovsk, as I mentioned in my previous videos. It's just, how do you say it? More of a, but it's being more and more under full 100. The Russians have probably cleared most of the Ukrainians that are in the northern part of Kupyansk, and that maybe the southern part still has some Ukrainian resistance, but now it's under mostly Russian control. But yeah, there's no center of Ukrainian resistance in the western part of Kupyansk anymore. So, but they've kind of moved over to the eastern part. But that being said, we actually had geolocated confirmation of the Russians being droned in this area on the eastern part of Kupyansk. So it shows that the Russians have crossed the Oskol River and have established themselves in this eastern part of Pokrovsk. Some mappers are saying the Russians are now pushing, from the from their positions up here down towards this industrial zone and the northern part here, and that we don't have any geolocated confirmation of the Russians being up in this area, that, like this mapper says, but I wouldn't put it past that the Russians are right now trying to take this kind of more built up area here. This with there's like some high rise buildings, some industrial areas here, so that the Russians could take this area, they could accumulate this area on the eastern side, and this could be the center of, just as once they took these northern warehouses and this northern part of Kupyansk, this was where they were able to accumulate and then continue pushing into the southern part and central part of Kupyansk. Same thing happening here is that if the Russians could take this area right here, this could be the new axis of Russian resistance, of the Russian advance, as they push southwards, take more of this residential area here, and then cut off this kind of these warehouses industrial district of Kupyansk here, and make it very untenable to hold. So I have so now that the Russians are battling for the eastern part of Kupyansk, it's going to be very much a big how do you say it? Now that, I do think that Kupyansk will also probably be taken in November, same as against Pokrovsk and Mitrograd. So the fall of those two towns will be a very big blow for the Ukrainian morale, and not just morale, which is it's also would be very strategically important for the Russians. And then in the more northern part here, the Russians have taken some fields between Ordania and Blodivka. They took these two villages in the last month or so just kind of improving their positions. We also saw that they connected, this map has been updated to show that they've connected the bridgehead, the Bolovia bridgehead with the Drishnia bridgehead, so, this has been taken. So they're probably also trying to clear more of these fields here, and probably the main goal is to maybe between Kamyanka and this area is probably also just to make the bridgehead here a bit more stable. So probably right now the main Russian axis of attack is to take the village of Dorashnika here, and probably just clear out these kind of fields here just to have a better connection with the between the two lines of contact here. But yeah, but the fields between Ordania and Blodavka has been cleared up. And then in the Volchansk area, kind of the same thing in the Kharkov direction. There actually hasn't not been that much changes this week in the Volchansk direction. Right now, the biggest, I think we had geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in this grain silo, this area right here, which is part of this southern, how do you say it, southern citadel here. Which is the main axis of Ukrainian resistance in the southern part of Volchansk. I probably should stop saying axis. I mean, even that's the right word. The YouTube algorithm might misinterpret that. I don't know. But the anyway, the this is the main center of Ukrainian resistance here, and the fact that we had Russian troops being in this grain silo shows that they are in this citadel, and right now they're trying to probably clear this entire area here. So if they can clear it, then Volchansk is going to fall. We also, we talked about last week the Russians took Dnipropetrovsk, but we have not seen any more updates since then. So we just had more updates that the southern citadel of Volchansk being fought over, and because that is the main center of resistance, and if it falls, then the Russians would be able to clear this kind of some of these residential areas for the rest of southern Volchansk very easily, and then Volchansk will fall. And I talked about last week how Volchansk and Kupyansk kind of combine to the main probably goal is to completely capture this entire area in the northeastern part of Kharkov. So it'll be a very big gain for the Russians once they take that. But yeah, that is the Kupyansk and Kharkov directions. Now we're gonna go kind of more south here, and we're gonna go to the Lyman direction. And this week, the Russians are continuously improving their positions to make the encirclement of Lyman, so then they can storm it at a later point. The biggest thing is that we had 100%. We had geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in this kind of like dachas to the north, the southeast of Lyman. We also, most mappers are saying that they've also, so this entire forest right here has been basically captured by the Russians, and a lot of Russians are saying they're now the main. They've actually cut this road right here. Now it's not as it's not like it's physically cut, but it could be easily uncut if the Ukrainians launch a counterattack. So what the Russians want to do is capture this small little, not the small build, but it's a singular building, pretty built up, kind of. I think it's like a hotel or something that's on this lake here, and the Russians want to take it so that this could be the center of Russian. They could then hold on to it and then cut off the main highway between Lyman and Seversk. So the Russians probably have cut it here, but the Ukrainians probably could kick them out. But if the Russians could take the main stronghold in this direction, then they could actually secure themselves on this road and take it. Now, before I made this video, about a day ago, we had some. In the center part, before I think Saturday, we had most of Yampil was actually taken by the Russians. But then we got some geolocated confirmation of the Russians bombing the Ukrainians in the center of Yampil here. So, we don't know if those were archived. This was new. So it seems like Yampil's still being fought over. It was almost certain, before I thought Yampil was almost completely taken, and the Russians would then continue towards Orzania and Dubrova, and could clear this area up to the Seversky Donetsk River here. But it does seem like Yampil is still being fought over. So, we shall see how that develops. And then a bit more to the north here, the Russians are making huge strides in this area to the west of Seversk. Most sources are saying Novoselivka has been taken. We talked about this already, but this map has not been updated. But that actually does make. I actually don't fault them for not saying Novoselivka has not been taken, because actually we don't have any. The Russians don't, I don't think, raise their flags in this direction. Unless I was wrong. Maybe I got amnesia and wasn't here, because I was on vacation and maybe I didn't see the update on that. I mean, I follow still on Telegram and Twitter and everything, but and YouTube. But I actually, maybe I missed it because I was on vacation. I didn't see the post of them raising their flags here, but. But yeah, but most people are saying Novoselivka has been taken by the Russians. But the biggest thing is that in this week is that the Russians have taken more and more of these fields and forest area to the west of Sidonia, Chernogokovo, Novoselivka, and they're now reaching the outskirts of the villages of Alexandrivka and Korcha Yar here, which is a very big gain for the Russians. I don't know if this is just them clearing it and making it as a gray zone and just pushing the Ukrainians further away so that they could have more stable positions in this area, or if they're actually intending to maybe take Korcha Yar and Alexandrivka and have this be the new defense line so that maybe it just protects their flanks a bit more. I don't know, but it seems like a lot of mappers are saying that these fields are now under Russian control. So, I mean, eventually the Russians would have had pushed here anyway towards the Oskal River just so they could continue cutting off the Borovia bridgehead, which I think will be the next target after Lyman falls. But I think, right now I think they're just trying to make some buffer space. The biggest battles again are in Yampil In Stavka, we talked about last week how the Russians entered the most northern part of Stavka. Now we don't know what happened to that this week, but again, the battle for Stavka is still ongoing. Also had the Russians being in the northern part of Dobrashevia here, but the battle for that is still ongoing. You have no changes there. But again, that these like villages, Stavka for the north, Dobrashevia for the Stavka for the west, Dobrashevia for the north, Yampil for the south. These are kind of again these are small island hopping adventures. The Russians are slowly but surely. Dobrashevia is taken, even though the road from the north to Lyman has basically been cut with the capture of Novoselivka. Taking Dobrashevia would allow them to would allow the Russians an actual foothold to accumulate forces to start that offensive into the northern part of Lyman and not just cut the logistics. Taking Stavki, and again, the Russians are now taking a bunch of these fields to the west of Zaporizhia, allows them to be on the more higher ground, because Stavka and this kind of area is more on the high ground, and this allows them to have Lyman under constant surveillance. Taking Yampil and these villages to the south here not only cuts off the logistics from Lyman to Lyman from the south and complicates the defenses of Seversk, it also allows them to attack Lyman from the south here. So again, they're not, and also we could say that the third battle for Lyman has actually started technically, because again, we talked about the Russians enter this kind of Dasha area of Lyman. Some people are saying that even this area right here is under Russian control, but we do know that the Russians have entered Lyman, so we can now technically say that the third battle for Lyman is now starting. So while Kupyansk and Pokrovsk are probably going to fall in November, I wouldn't, Lyman and even Seversk, which we'll talk about right now, are slowly being encircled so that they could be taken within, maybe not November, but maybe sometime during the winter campaign. Very soon, though. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Seversk direction, as I mentioned. The same thing happening here. The biggest advances are now happening in the south, because it seems like the Russians have basically finished all their advances in the north here. They took the village of Dnipropetrovsk. They have taken all these kind of mine shafts and mine places to the north of Seversk. So now they're like, okay, we're accumulating forces here to do an attack on Seversk from the north. But, the southern part was still a bit more open, and, they needed to tighten the encirclement from the south here. And this is what's happening this week. We had Jilic confirmation of the Russians being in this kind of intersection of two rail lines here. There's a giant Ukrainian trench network that's right here. The Russians captured a smaller one, but also a pretty big one that was operating around this direction. So, but again, as you can see, these are a bunch of open fields, and because of drones, the Ukrainians could probably take out the Russians here very easily. So the Russians really need actually these strongholds to accumulate forces in, and that's probably also why they're entering Zwanovka. This is we had Jilic Russians being in the southern part of Zwanovka, and the Russians are now storming this town. This town's been really destroyed. So it's a lot of crumbled building, crumbled constructions and shit like that. But again, it'd be very. Sorry, I'm very tired this week or today. But again, taking Zwanovka would be a very good gain for the Russians, because then that'll be a forward operating base to start assaulting Seversk from the south. The biggest hurdle for the Russians is that mostly in this area right here, but I think also in this area right here, around this area, is that this is where the Ukrainians are more higher ground, because Seversk is on the lowland riverland, and there's a bunch of trenches here. The Ukrainians could then launch counterattacks on if the Russians try to enter Seversk. So now, if the Russians do what they want and try to encircle Seversk like this, as you can see, this puts Seversk in a pocket, but not in a complete. It's not completely cut off yet, and the Ukrainians can still. Well, it's going to be very hard because the logistics are completely bombed out. Is that they could withdraw if they want to, but knowing how the Ukrainians aren't just going to give up Seversk without a fight. So I do think the Russians will, once they have Zwanovka taken, probably start trying to enter Seversk from the south, enter Seversk from the north. It's very built up. There's a bunch of positions here. But I think one of the biggest things is that, once Yampil is taken and the Russians have taken this area right here, they can then take the villages of Kiki and Plodnovka and then try to use these positions near Dronovka to make some sort of small bridgehead in this direction, and then push southwards here and put more and more pressure on the northern part of Seversk. And then from this area, then you could see how how Seversk could be completely, as you can see at this point, then Seversk is a lot more in a pickle. So probably Seversk will probably hold out longer than Lyman, but it is the Russians are putting in the squeeze here. So Seversk will probably be is definitely on the chopping block. And then lastly, we'll be talking about the Kostyantynivka direction. And there's been only some small changes here. The biggest one is we had another geolocated confirmation. I think this time in this area near the shopping mall here of the Russians being here. So it does show more and more proof that kind of almost everything from north of this rail line right here and then to the south of this highway, this area is either in a gray zone or is now has more and more Russian DRGs operating in it. Maybe the Ukrainians clear them out because it's going to probably be very hard to supply the Russian troops here. There's no big, unlike in Pokrovsk, right? If we look at Pokrovsk, there was, these kind of bigger villages, Shantimko, Pashana. As you can see, these are pretty decent-sized towns that the Russians could accumulate forces to then infiltrate Pokrovsk. But in Kostyantynivka, there's not really that much. There's Chasiv Yar, but Chasiv Yar is more, more to the north here, and they have, the way, there's still a lot of Ukrainians in this area, and so the Russians would have to move south and move through this area. But as you can see, Stupochki, Prochichnia, these are villages that have been razed to the ground, and so they have to use the man-made defenses here as like kind of where they accumulate, and that does not allow for a lot of troops to hold on there. So it's probably a lot less tenuous, this area, but we keep getting locations of the Russians being in this kind of southeastern part of Kostyantynivka. So I do think the Russians are in there, but I do think it's very precarious. But we shall see if the Russians are able to supply their troops here. Now, probably what the Russians want to do is use these kind of suburbs of Kostyantynivka in the south as where they will accumulate forces to help the forces here, and that's what they're doing. So this week we had more and more. We had geolocated confirmation of the Russians clearing these like kind of tree lines that are to the north of Ivanopilia. We had some maps are now saying the Russians, after taking Plychishigir, are now trying to take more and more of these, moving along this kind of reservoir here, just to maybe improve their flank a little bit. So it does show probably that maybe the Russians have taken Plychishigir and Dnipropetrovsk, but the main center of Ukrainian resistance is now in Ivanopilia, which is the biggest suburb of them all here. And so I think what the Russians want to do will probably try to maybe capture these gardens and these dachas here, which will cut off the supply to Ivanopilia, and maybe try to attack it from the north. That's probably what I would do, and then attack it from the east, and then probably attack it from the south here. So try to put some squeeze of Ivanopilia. The main operation obviously is to take something like this, and then if they could have something like this, then they could have a solid, from the south here, from Klibin Balka, they could then accumulate forces in Toretsk and then move them through these villages that are pretty big, and then enter Kostyantynivka. So these could be like supply dumps, supply logistics areas where the Russians could accumulate forces to then enter Kostyantynivka and keep building a bridgehead in Kostyantynivka, if you will. So yeah, there's that. And then lastly, we will go to the Sumy direction. There's not been that much changes in the Sumy direction. There's only been one change, which is we had geolocated confirmation of the Ukrainians clearing out the village of Kostyantynivka, which makes sense. Ever since the Russians lost their position in Dnipropetrovsk, I thought that this entire kind of salient right here would be cleared out. So it does seem like the Russians retreated to the other side of the border. And right now the main axis of Russian positions are around this area, but Alexievka is still under full Russian control. But it seems like the Ukrainians have the initiative in this area, and I bet that that we'll see more attacks on Alexievka in the future by the Ukrainians here. But that's the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed this weekly Russian-Ukraine war update. Be sure to subscribe to my channel to continue receiving these weekly war updates. Comment your thoughts, like this video. Share this video around if you can, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day. So aim high and wander on.